بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين.
The UAE and Bahrain hope that this deal solidifies an anti-Iran coalition. And the Israelis are cheering the fact it reduces their pariah status in the region. The ceremony today was designed to echo the imagery of the celebrated Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel, signed on the South Lawn in 1978. That was the very first Arab-Israeli agreement. The Palestinians have every reason to feel excluded, and no war, not even a skirmish, has been brought to an end today. But for the president, this is powerful imagery for the next 50 days on the campaign trail. This diplomatic accord with the UAE and with Bahrain raises a still more tantalizing question. As Riyadh watches the reaction closely, might Saudi Arabia be poised to normalize relations with Israel? If so, that would be a truly historic development.
It's a tiny country, isolated, surrounded by a hostile Arab world. In our first 70 years, we made peace with Egypt and Jordan, and then in 2020, we made the Abraham Accords, peace with another 4 Arab states. Now look at what happens when we make peace between Saudi Arabia and Israel. The whole Middle East changes. We tear down the walls of enmity. We bring the possibility of prosperity and peace to this entire region, the blessing of a new Middle East between Israel, Saudi Arabia, and our other neighbors. We will not only bring down barriers between Israel and our neighbors, we'll build a new corridor of peace and prosperity that connects Asia through the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Israel, to Europe. This is an extraordinary change, a monumental change, another pivot of history.
There were reports that you had suspended talks.
No, that's not true.
Not true. So you think, if you were to characterize it, are you close?
Every day we get closer. It seems it's, for the first time, real one, serious. We're going to see how it goes.
Can you make a deal with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu? Is that somebody you can deal with?
Well, in Saudi Arabia policy, we don't interfere of who's running each country, who's there. We work with him. Now we don't have a relation with Israel, but if Biden administration succeeded to make, I believe, the biggest historical deal since the end of the Cold War, then we're going to start a relationship, and that relationship going to be continuous regardless of who's running Israel. So,
I mean, he's 73, you're 38, but you think maybe there's a chance that you could deal with him?
If we have a breakthrough of reaching a deal that give the Palestinians their needs and make the region come, we're going to work with whoever's there.
Not to go too far, but the concessions Israel would have to give the Palestinians, what would that look like?
That's part of the negotiation.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't want to describe things because I want to see really a good life for the Palestinians. So I want just to continue the negotiation with the Biden administration to be sure.
الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونتوب إليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم وبعد. The peace treaties which have been signed by certain political leaders in the Arab world, and it has been extended now, talks to even the non-Arab Islamic world like Pakistan, like Malaysia and so forth, and countries in Africa regarding peace or normalization of relations with the Jews. Why are these treaties null and void? Well, we can say so for 6 reasons. The first reason why it's null and void is because all of these treaties have the condition that war and will end between the Muslims and the Jews for all eternity. I mean, the peace treaty is not a cessation of hostilities. You know, there's two things you might have to understand that occurs. I mean, between nations. You know, whether they're Muslim and unbelieving nations or between unbelieving nations themselves. You have something which is a peace treaty, right? Which means that you will remain, you know, neighbors, and will have no conflict, and you will have normal relations between one another forever. And there's a cessation of hostilities, where a state of war still exists, but you have a disengagement of the armies for a period of time, because they find it both in their benefit just to disengage in an active pursuit of hostilities. What these treaties are, they're not a cessation of hostilities, okay? Because a cessation of hostilities occurred after each war that the Arabs fought with the Jews, each war having them losing each war because they fought under a banner other than the banner of Islam. So for instance, after the 48 war, there was a cessation of hostilities. There was a disengagement of the armies. After the 56 war, there was also cessation of hostilities. There was a disengagement of the armies. After the 67 war, the same thing, there was a cessation of hostilities. After the 73 war, there was a cessation of hostilities, but a state of war still existed. And that's why you couldn't travel to each country. You could not travel back and forth. There was no embassies. There was no exchange of embassies. There were no trade, supposedly, between the countries, because there was a cessation. There was still a state of war. All right? And most of the Muslim world is still in a state of war with the Jews. I mean, at least legally. You know, I mean, for instance, if you take a Muslim country that hasn't signed the treaty as of yet, let's take, for instance, like Saudi Arabia, for instance, it's still in a state of war with the Jews legally. Okay, Pakistan also is still in a state of war with the Jews, but this is being changed. I mean, already a certain number of countries have signed a peace treaty. So the first reason why these treaties are null and void and are not binding upon us Muslims is because they are not cessation of hostilities. It's not like the Muslims are saying, well, we're in a state of weakness, and so therefore we need to have some time in order to strengthen ourselves. But what's happening is that they have decided that they want to have peace forever and a normalization of relations. And so therefore this goes against the command to wage jihad until the day of judgment. And so therefore it's a denial of texts of the Quran and the Hadith, denial of teachings of the Islam. And so therefore on this count it's null and void. The second count, while they are null and void, is because these treaties include stipulations to end the teachings which they consider to be anti-Jewish teachings. Like I quoted Shamir in the 1991 Madrid talk. So we'd like to see an end of the poisonous, what they call the poisonous teachings in your lands. Okay. In other words, all the verses in the Quran which talk about the Jews, which the Jews do not like, all the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, which talk about the Jews, which the Jews do not like. Okay. These have to be removed. You can no longer teach them anymore. This is part of the stipulations of these treaties. And so therefore these treaties include for us to deny part of the Quran and the Hadith. And likewise, this is another reason why, in fact, whoever agrees to this, it becomes an unbeliever. Becomes a kafir. He becomes murtad, an apostate from the religion of Islam. And the reason why is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran that you will not find a people, لا تجد قوما يؤمنون بالله وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ. You will not find a people who believe in Allah on the day of judgment. يُوَادُونَ مَنْ حَادَ اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ. You will not find a people who believe in Allah on the last day who love those who oppose Allah and His Messenger. وَلَوْ كَانَ آبَاءَهُمْ أَوْ أَبْنَاءَهُمْ أَوْ إِخْوَانَهُمْ أَوْ عَشِيرَتُهُم. Even if they were their fathers or their sons or their brethren or their families. So in this verse in Surat Al-Mujadila, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that nobody who believes in Allah on the last day would love those who oppose Allah and His Messenger, even if it was his relatives, be his father, his parents, his children, his brethren, or his greater community. And so therefore this is a cause of unbelief, and this is a second reason why these treaties are null and void. The third reason why these treaties are null and void is because they is an acknowledgement to what the Jews have taken from the lands of the Muslims, have usurped from the lands of the Muslims. In other words, now before the treaties were signed, let's take the Palestinians for example, right? The Palestinians believed that the Jews who were occupying part of Palestine or all of Palestine, right, and even the part which they had called the State of Israel, that they had usurped the land from them. They had taken that land from them by force, and that this was not their land. But once a peace treaty occurs, right, no matter how they slice or dice the map, this becomes land which now the Muslims have acknowledged and said to the aggressor, to the one who has stolen the lands of the Muslims, that this is yours. We acknowledge that because now we've inside peace. And so therefore, this is a third reason why, because this land of Palestine doesn't belong to the Palestinians, and it doesn't belong to the Arabs. It belongs to the Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So let us imagine, for example, that all of the Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and this is something which will not occur, and by Allah's mercy, of course, but let's just imagine, just for the sake of argument, that all of Ummah Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam decided to sue for peace with the Jews and acknowledge what the Jews have taken, except for the 50 or 60 young men in this room, right? That's not their right to do so. If they want to leave the Islamic religion, that land belongs to us, because we are part of the Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Even if we happen to live in London or in the United States or wherever we happen to be, on the North Pole, the South Pole, whatever. Okay, and the proof of that is what Allah subhanahu wa taala has said in Surat Al-Anbiya. وَلَقَدْ كَتَبْنَا فِي الزَّبُورِ مِنْ بَعْدِ الذِّكْرِ أَنَّ الْأَرْضَ يَرِثُهَا عِبَادِيَ الصَّالِحُونَ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has written, has decreed in the Zabur. The Zabur here means all the revealed scriptures. After Allah has decreed that in the dhikr, which refers to Allāh al-Mahfūz, the preserved tablet, which Allah has written the decrees in, that the earth will be inherited by His righteous servants. The ulama have said, the scholars amongst the Salaf, have said that the righteous servants here refers to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his companions and those who follow them until the day of judgment. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decreed, He sent down this. Not only did He decree it in the book of decrees before He created the heavens and the earth, but in every single scripture which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent down to humanity, it is written in there that the earth will be inherited by Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his followers. And that is this ummah. So this land does not belong to them. It belongs to Allah Azza wa Jal, who is the creator of the earth, and He has given it to this ummah. And the ummah has, Palestine belongs to this ummah just like the whole earth does, and nobody can then give it up on behalf of the Muslims. So this is the third reason why these treaties and accords are false, null, and void. The fourth reason is that these treaties and these accords were done without the consultation of the Muslim ummah. In other words, the political entities which rule the Muslims, right, engaged in a peace treaty without either the consultation of the Muslim ummah or the pleasure of the Muslim ummah on behalf of the Muslim ummah. Let alone the fact that the people who represent the Muslims, right, nobody put them in charge of the Muslims in the first place. I mean, they're illegitimate for the most part. Okay, they took force. I mean, they took control by force, and they ruled us without Allah's Sharia. And that's why the Muslims, I mean, in every single country in the Islamic world, when they're given the choice between their governments and the Sharia, they all overwhelmingly want their governments. But it's only because they have to be forced to submit to these governments by the end of the bayonet, right, and the bullet, that they are, they have no position but just to, acquiesce to the situation. And so therefore, besides the fact that who put these people in charge for us, right, the second of all, they went engaged in a treaty on our behalf of the Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and our descendants until the day of judgment, to which we neither, right, were taken our opinion for it, nor did we acknowledge, or are pleased with. And so therefore that renders it null and void. I mean, now in Islamic law, right, let's say Brother Kashif has a house or a car or any sort of property. Can I, without him entrusting me as his wakil, and without his agreement and his pleasure, just for me to go out there and say, okay, I'm going to sell you his car, take his keys, and so forth? No, of course not. That would render it null and void. So, in the same way, how about more so that somebody does something on behalf of the Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and neither the true leaders of the Ummah are scholars, right, and the true legitimate, leaders of the Ummah, the people of importance in our Ummah, amongst the Muslims, believing, practicing Muslims, were neither consulted nor their pleasure has been given to us. The fifth cause as to why these treaties and these accords and these agreements are null and void is because they are treaties which occurred due to compulsion. Okay? If you force somebody to sell something, for instance, if I come to you in Islamic law, put a gun to your head, and say, sign this paper, right, giving me over the property of your house, that treaty, that contract, even though you signed it, right, and you bring witness to it, is still considered null and void because you were compelled into that point. And these treaties, in the same way, the Muslims were compelled to it. They neither sought it or not, but because the Muslims lost 4 wars, and because after the Gulf War, I mean, the control, especially the United States, on the Islamic world became so paramount, and there's no before the Americans were sort of unable to have such a control over the Middle East due to their fear of the Soviets, because there was a competition between the Soviets, right, and the Americans. Each of them had allies in the region, right, and they fought proxy wars between each other in different places around the world. But when the Soviets collapsed, right, then the West was left with a free hand to take over the Islamic world once again, as they did, like for instance, before World War I, or after World War I. And so therefore, the Muslims were compelled to the state, not having wanted it whatsoever. And so therefore, this is a 5th reason as to why these contracts are null and void. The 6th reason why these contracts are null and void, because these not contracts, but these treaties and these accords, because these treaties and accords will result in a corruption of not only the religion of the Muslims, but the worldly affairs of the Muslims. Religiously, in the sense that these accords entail for us to deny certain texts of the Quran and the Sunnah. And we know each one of us, right, that if we were to deny a text of the Quran and the Hadith, right, we would then lose our faith, and we will, end up in a state of unbelief, and the unbelievers, their destiny is the hellfire, right? We also know that part of this is that it will result for us to give up the obligation of jihad, and that when you give up the obligation of jihad, what did the Prophet ﷺ say when you give up jihad and you hold on to the cow's tails, right, and you engage in ina, which is a type of riba, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will strike upon you a humiliation which He will never lift from you until you return back to your religion. This is the hadith of Abu Dawud, that if you leave jihad and you engage in worldly pursuits, that means by holding the cow tails, and engage in ina, which is a type of riba trade, Allah will strike you with a humiliation which will never be lifted from you until you return back to your religion. So here, this is another reason why, because it causes a corruption of our worldly affairs, of our religious affairs, plus our worldly affairs. Also, the nature of the Jews is that wherever they go, they spread corruption on the earth. And this is the nature of their people. This is why they were cursed by their prophets in their books. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لُعِنَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا مِنْ بَنِي إِسْرَائِيلِ, the people who disbelieve, the unbelievers of the tribe of Israel were cursed, okay, by whom? عَلَى لِسَانِ دَاوُود, upon the tongue of Dawood, David, the prophet David, وَعِيسَى ibn Maryam, and Jesus, the son of Mary. Okay, why? ذَلِكَ بِمَا عَصَوْا وَكَانُوا يَعْتَدُونَ. That is because of what they sinned and their transgressions. So they were cursed by their prophet sent to them, by Dawood alayhi salam and by Isa ibn Maryam, for their transgressions and their sinfulness. And this is their nature. Wherever they go, where any sort of filth in the world, any sort of corruption, you can lay it at the doorstep of the Jews. This is, Allah's sunnah on the earth. Okay? And so therefore, one of the problems that will occur out of this peace treaty, because now with normalization of the religion of relations, right now you're finding that, Israeli firms are going to different Islamic lands, like Oman, like Qatar, besides, of course, Egypt and Jordan, which have already entered into peace treaties with them. They're traveling to Malaysia, they're traveling to Pakistan, they're traveling to different parts of Africa in order to, control Muslim wealth, Muslim resources, spread their corruption throughout the Islamic world. And so while in many ways, because they were, there was a state of hostilities, even though it really wasn't a true state of hostilities, there was some sort of barrier. Now these barriers are being dropped one after the other. And even on a psychological level, so much so, as I mentioned in the beginning lecture, you find a young man in Palestine who now has converted to Judaism, and you also find one Jordanian father who wants to name his son, and took it to court in order to name his son Ishaq Rabin, out of his love of the slain Israeli president. And likewise, if the argument that is made that peace will bring certain benefits to the Muslims is a false argument, because if you look at what's claimed to be brought to the Muslims, is really harm. For instance, they said we'll gain financial aid. Okay, the kuffar, whether it's the United States or the European Union or the Japanese, whenever they give financial aid to the Muslims, they don't give it because out of love of the Muslim people and just their charitable hearts, right? But they give it because they seek some sort of greater benefit to return towards them. Likewise, that if the Palestinians have their own state by which they can, rule themselves, it's better for them to be in a state of occupation. Is that true? I mean, for the Palestinians to be rendered in basically in Bantustans throughout the West Bank and the Gaza, for instance, this is a state where they're basically surrounded and their economies are held in control, and they're actually being oppressed by their own people in the name of peace. I mean, this obviously is no benefit to them. It would be better for them to be patient and to strengthen themselves and continue with the intifada until Allah gave them victory than to be that. So, in other words, the sixth reason why, in summary, the sixth reason why the peace treaty is null and void is because any of the benefits claimed are really not true benefits, and the harms that will return to the Muslims in terms of their religion and worldly affairs are innumerable. Only Allah knows.